This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's ChangeMaker is Deborah De Santis, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, the country's largest community development financial institution devoted to housing solutions for those at risk of homelessness. On her watch, CSH has tripled its lending and support toward the creation of more than 300,000 permanent, stable homes for people struggling through the trauma of homelessness, lack of health care, and intergenerational poverty. Deb, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure. So thank you for this opportunity, Katie.
Before we get started discussing the Corporation for Supportive Housing, let's get to know you and your journey into affordable housing. So take us back to how it all started for you.
Sure. It starts back in state government, actually, in the state of New Jersey, where I was working for then Governor Christy Todd Whitman. And I was in the Department of Community Affairs that oversees a number of different programs, but probably the biggest program is affordable housing. And I just got very interested in affordable housing issues. And at some point in her administration, I sought the opportunity to work at the Housing Finance Agency, which is the agency in state government that funds affordable housing, so single family and multifamily. I did that for about 4 years. I was the executive director there. And it was at the agency that I actually came into contact with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and also really grew an interest in what was then referred to as special needs housing.
You've been named one of the 10 most influential Americans for homelessness reform. You're the president and CEO for the Corporation of Supportive Housing. But first, tell us and our listeners, because we have a wide variety of listeners, just start it real basic and tell us, what is supportive housing?
Great question. Very simply, supportive housing is affordable housing with services for those individuals and families who need the services connected to the housing to help them thrive in the housing and also in the community. So typically residents are individuals who are at risk of homelessness, who have experienced homelessness, or who have a history of institutional care. Most importantly, supportive housing residents have a lease and the services are flexible. And so the housing is not contingent upon someone taking the services.
And so why are the services so important? I mean, not just quality of life, but what other, maybe data or results have you seen when affordable housing is coupled with services?
Yeah, we see a number of things depending on the population, but I think across the board, what we see is that when someone is in supportive housing, their housing stability is very strong. So typically people in supportive housing stay in supportive housing, so that retention is really important. And then we see studies where if there are children in the family, we've seen where the children have better education outcomes because they're going to school. We see studies of supportive housing where individuals have better health outcomes. So, across the board, it's really exciting to see that actually when you do pair the housing with services, people are faring better.
And you've been there for 14 years?
A little longer than that because I started with CSH as the director of one of our state programs and then became president. But I've been president for about 14 years now.
And how have you seen supportive housing maybe change over this? What's happened with either the level of services or just the delivery model? Has there been a change or has it been pretty consistent this whole time?
A number of things have changed. Certainly for CSH, I think the most dramatic change is how we think about supportive housing, the intervention supportive housing. So very early on in our history, CSH was created primarily to help communities address chronic homelessness. So those individuals with a history of health issues, typically mental health issues or substance issues, living on the streets or in shelters for a prolonged time, there was this thought that if we could get them into housing and then connect them to the services, they'd be better off. Uh, and CSH was created to bring capital to communities around the country to help communities develop the housing, build provider capacity, and then do the advocacy work at the federal, state, and local level. And along our journey, what we realized was that the homeless system itself is a very small system, and when you look at the individuals and families that are cycling through that system, there's a larger story. It's not that one day they woke up and they became homeless. What we saw for those individuals who had those health issues and that long experience with homelessness, typically they had some other system involvement, like justice involvement or child welfare involvement. And so we started working with providers around the country to really understand how to engage those other systems so that we could educate them about the role of housing and services in not just ending someone's experience with homelessness, but preventing it. So I would say that was one of the biggest changes, was this realization that we needed to do the work to engage those larger systems. And then I think the other big sea change for us and the supportive housing field is to recognize the importance of not just building housing units, not just getting people housed. That's really important. But we want to make sure that when individuals and families get housed, that they have what they need to actually thrive, so that we're not warehousing individuals and families, because that's not what we want. We don't want to just take credit for getting people housed. We want to understand what that trajectory looks like once they get housed, and if indeed, longer term, do their health outcomes improve? Do they have access to employment? Do they have access to better education outcomes, etc.?
You just laid out several ways of understanding how people get into a homeless situation, and you've brought up important pieces about engaging early on with services. It really brings me to another point. Tell us about this Fuse initiative.
Yeah, Fuse is a great initiative, and if I can, I want to share a little lore with you. It actually came out of a conversation many, many years ago in New York City, where the commissioner of the jail system in New York City was in an elevator with the commissioner of the homeless system. And there were witnesses, and they were having a conversation about people in their systems. And I'm somewhat embellishing, but the conversation went something like this: your people are ending up in my system, your people are ending up in my
Mm.
system.
Hmm.
And so CSH used that as an opportunity to work with those two systems to look at how people actually were flowing between systems. And I hypothesized that if we could target the individuals who were, I call it ping-ponging between the systems most frequently, and use instead a supportive housing intervention, could we indeed reduce their experience with either of those systems or both of those systems? From that conversation came this idea that we now refer to as Fuse. In New York City, it started looking at those two systems, justice and homelessness. And we have now worked with a good number of communities to do very similar work, looking at different systems. Sometimes we're looking at the homeless system and the healthcare system. We just finished a initiative with Portland and Multnomah County in Oregon. We did a Fuse initiative there, looking at a jail, homeless, and healthcare involved population to see if we could use supportive housing to reduce, again, their system involvement. And the results of that study initiative just came out. And indeed, it shows that, with supportive housing, there is a reduction in their usage of those systems. Jail stays, for instance, goes down when people are in housing and have access to services. And what this study then went on to say was, there was a population of a little over close to I think 1,800, and a portion of those actually got into supportive housing. But if all of the individuals got into supportive housing, it would have saved the county and city over $10 million. So, what we have seen time and time again when we study supportive housing and its efficacy in communities, we see cost savings and in many of those communities, and we see better outcomes for the individuals or families that get into housing with the services.
So you're saying that if chronically homeless individuals, in this particular study, either avoided or ended their chronic homelessness with supportive housing, $10 million in savings would be realized? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because what happens, Katie, is those individuals that I referenced in that elevator conversation, right? So they're not going into jail one day out of the year. What we see are those individuals going into jail multiple a number of days throughout the year, and then going over into the homeless system, and then perhaps needing emergency room care. And so when you look at the cost of those different systems over a year, and you add that up, and you compare that to the cost of someone being in housing with services, there's most definitely a difference in the cost. It's costlier to have people cycling between systems than it is to have them
Mm-hmm.
in housing, thriving with services.
So those savings would have been realized in either avoided jail or ER or Medicaid savings. That's how those costs would be avoided then.
Absolutely right. That's right.
So, one of the questions I have is how did the name Fuse, like, where did that come from? What's the story there?
Let me just be perfectly honest and say one thing we don't do really well at CSH is come up with catchy names for our initiatives. But FUSE stood for Frequent User Service Enhancement. So it was that individual who's using the systems frequently, the frequent user, and the idea was that if we could provide the services with housing, that we could avoid that ping-ponging effect.
Well, that's still catchy. It gives us
Yeah.
a background of what it is.
I guess.
I thought I thought maybe you were gonna tell me that you were gonna light the fuse on, ending
I'm sure that
homelessness
was a
or
little bit
something.
of it, but no.
All right, hang on, Deb. We have to stop right here. But coming up in the conclusion of my chat with Deb De Santis, the president and CEO of CSH, Deb shares examples of how developers can be successful with supportive housing.
They design their buildings in a way that they will be accommodating to the larger community. So offering space or offering programming that will be available to the larger community.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.